In 1977, for a mere $160, or about $830 today, you could have purchased the Kenwood KA-3500 Integrated amplifier. It was rated at 40 watts per channel into 8 ohms, both channels driven, at not more than 0.2% THD from 20 Hz to 20 kilohertz, and its frequency response was listed as plus or minus 2 dB over that range, and the phono frequency response was listed at plus or minus half a dB. We'll get into the measurements, of course, in a little bit, but first we'll take our little tour of the front and the back, and I'll pop the cover off and we can look inside it. Spoiler alert, this has had the output transistors and emitter resistors replaced on it, so it's not 100% original. However, the capacitors look pretty much original as best I can tell. So with that being said, let's take our little tour and then we'll get into the data, and then I will tell you about what I thought after listening to it and using it. Here is a close-up view of the KA-3500 integrated amplifier. Starting on the left, we have our power on-off switch. An LED comes on when it's powered on. 1/4-inch headphone jack. Speaker control, you can do A, B, and A plus B. Bass, treble controls, balance control, loudness on, and we also have a high filter we can switch on. Obviously volume control. We have 2 tape monitor loops, and then we have phono, tuner, and auxiliary inputs. Going around rear, we see we have a total of 2 switched outlets, 1 unswitched outlet. We have our speaker connectors, not my favorite style, but they work. We have a DIN jack for one of the A tape deck, I guess it is, and we have another tape monitor loop there, ground loop for the phono, and then the 3 inputs for the phono, tuner, and auxiliary. When you remove the cover, looking down from the top, you can see our power supply transformer, 2 big filter caps. This is the heatsink for the output transistors, which are here, and then kind of just shows you the topology that's being used, or at least kind of what's going on the inside. Here's just another view of the inside from a different angle. Here is a view showing the output transistors, which have all been replaced. That was not my doing. And just another view from above, kind of showing your DC bias adjustments here and here. The KA-3500 has a 1 watt into 8 ohm specifications at 1000 Hertz, and that is for the THD, which it states should be better than 0.06%, and we are indeed better than 0.06%. Here's our standard THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the KA-3500 putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohm loads. You can see the THDs are both right around, we'll call it 0.03%. SNRs are above 80 dB, and the THD plus noise is about minus 70 dB. The volume control was set to give gains of around 25 dB, and everything looks pretty nice. In case you're wondering about the harmonics, this simplifies it a little bit. You can see that the even harmonics are just a tad more than the odd harmonics. Maybe the left channels are about the same, but the right channel, the even harmonic, is higher than the odd harmonic. Here's our standard THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz with the KA-3500 putting out about 5 watts into 4 ohm loads. The distortion got a little worse for the left channel, but not really that bad overall. The SNRs got a bit worse into the 4 ohm loads, which you kind of expect when you go from an 8 ohm load to a 4 ohm load. THD plus noise, same thing, it got a bit worse, although the left channel got probably 12 dB worse. And I had adjusted the volume control as I did in the 8 ohm load case so that we have about 25 dB of gain. And in case you're curious what the harmonics look like, the same kind of thing is going on that we saw with the 8 ohms. We have our third or odd harmonic right here, higher than the even or second harmonic for the left channel. For the right channel, we have our even harmonic higher than the right channel odd harmonic. So it's kind of mixed on the harmonics. Here we have the KA-3500 putting out a bit over 42 watts, almost 43 watts into 8 ohm loads at better than 0.2% THD, which is the specification for the max THD at 40 watts into 8 ohm loads. You can see our SNRs are above 81 dB, and the gain was set so that we had about 25 dB of gain. What's interesting, if I get rid of the left channel, you can see the third harmonic here for the right channel is much less than the left channel's third harmonic, and we can see that in this harmonic graph here. Kind of mixed results. You have your even or second harmonic here, and the right channel is higher than the odd or third harmonic. However, the left channel even harmonic is lower than the left channel odd harmonic. So it's kind of mixed results. Here is the KA-3500's frequency response from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, with it putting out about 5 watts into 8 ohms. The specification is that it should be plus or minus 2 dB over that range, and we're definitely much better than that. At worst case, at the low end of the band, we're probably down, 9/10 of a dB. And we're not more than about 3/4 at the high end. So basically it's definitely meeting the frequency response requirement. Here is the 4 ohm load frequency response for the KA-3500 from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. It's putting out about 5 watts into 4 ohm loads, and the specification was plus or minus 2 dB. So at the high end of the band, we're at maybe 1.6 dB down, and we go up maybe 2/3 of a dB, and the channels seem to be balanced within 1/10 of a dB or so. So overall, the frequency response is within specification. Right now, I've got a 1 kilohertz, 158.4 millivolt signal going into the auxiliary input on the KA-3500, and I've adjusted the volume control to give me about as much gain as I think I could get without the distortion getting real bad. The volume control is at an 8 out of 10 position. You can see we're about 40 dB of gain, and our THD is still better than 0.2%. SNRs are still above 81 dB. The THD plus noise is starting to look, well, the worst case minus 57 dB. But we've got about 40 dB of gain, and I think if I go a little bit higher, it's going to start moving that THD up even more. Remember, the spec is 0.2% at rated power, but just for grins, I'm going to go ahead and go up to 9. So with it at 9, you can see our distortion really jumped quite a bit. So we'll say the volume control set for 8 would still give you a reasonable amount of gain if you needed it, as long as your signal level is, it's 160 millivolts, say. Here we have the KA-3500's output impedance from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. There is a specification that it should be at least 50 for the damping factor. And the right channel, if we use the value at 1 kilohertz, that is exactly 50 for a damping factor. And for the left channel at 1 kilohertz, we're about 20 to 21. So at least one channel meets the requirement and the other channel is not, but it's still really not that bad of a damping factor, all things considered. Here we have a plot showing the THD versus frequency for a couple different output power levels, and that's into 8 ohms from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz. Keep in mind that the worst case THD should be 0.2% at 40 watts. The minus 1.5 indicates about 30 watts, and minus 13.5 is about 2 watts. And it's changing by 3 dB with each decrement in power. It looks like this would be 0.2 dB, so pretty much meets the 0.2 dB requirement max, and that just happens to be for the left channel at about 30 watts. So it is doing fairly good as far as THD versus frequency. Here's the KA-3500's multitone response, with it putting out a bit over 4 watts into 8 ohms. This translates to a distortion-free range of 11 to 12 bits. Here is a plot showing the KR3500's crosstalk from 20 hertz to 20 kilohertz, with the active channel being driven by 5 watts into 8 ohms. There is not a specification for the crosstalk, but the worst case would be, oh, we'll just call it 40 dB here, and it's as good as a bit over 60 dB here in the middle of the band. Here is the input to input isolation of the KA-3500 from 20 Hz to 20 kHz, and there is not a requirement for this specification. However, what is going on is that I've got a signal applied to the auxiliary inputs, and that would be this line here for reference, and then I have shorts attached to the tuner inputs, and I go ahead and select the tuner input, and so what you see is the amount of leakage from the auxiliary channel over to the tuner channel. So at worst case, that would be the difference between minus 60 and plus 15, or about 75 dB of channel-to-channel isolation. Here is an IMD response plot for the KA-3500. The amplifier is putting out about, we'll say 4.5 watts into 8 ohm loads. The tones that are used are 60 Hertz and 7 kilohertz, and that is per the spec, which says that the IMD should be better than 0.2% at max rated power. Well, we're not at max rated power, but our two tones of concern would be 60 Hertz away from the 7 kilohertz, which would be right down here. And I'm just showing the left channel just because it's easier to see just one, but the other channel kind of gives similar performance. So I'm guessing if I added up the numbers, this probably would indeed meet the IMD requirement. This plot shows how the tone controls affect things, as well as the loudness switch and the high filter. Note that you can either select the loudness switch or the high filter. You can't do both of them the way the switch is set up. The specification for loudness is that it should be about 6 dB at 100 Hertz, and indeed the reference line for everything would be this blue line, kind of thick blue line, which is with everything flat. So at 100 Hertz, which should be right here, and we'd go up, we're pretty close to 6 dB at 100 Hertz, so that seems to work. The high filter says it should be down 3 dB at 7 kilohertz, so 7 kilohertz would be about somewhere in here, and the difference between this spot and this spot looks to me to be closer to 5 dB. Maybe it's 4, but it's a bit more than 3. So that just shows a little bit how the filters work, and then you can see how much the bass and treble controls affect things from where they're at with it flat. And I use the plus or minus 6 settings. I would assume that's dB, but those are the only two that I check. So you can kind of see how those compare. Right now I have the KA-3500's auxiliary inputs terminated into shorts. We have the outputs hooked up to 8 ohm loads, and we're just looking at the system noise of the unit, which at worst case would be minus 80 dBV down. There is no specification for it. I'm guessing this will be fairly quiet when I hook it up to the speakers. Right now I've got a 5 millivolt, 1 kilohertz signal going into the phono input of the KA-3500, and I'm measuring at the tape record out. I am applying A weighting, as there is a specification for SNR for the phono input with A weighting applied in a 5 millivolt signal, and that is, it should be at least 76 dB. So the right channel 76 dB, our left channel is not. THD's looking pretty good for a phono stage, better than, we'll say, 0.02%, and the THD plus noise is at least minus 66 dB down. So at least the THD SNR plot at 1 kilohertz for the phono stage with A weighting applied is fairly close to the specification. Here is the KA-3500's phono frequency response, and this is measured at the tape monitor record output, and this would be from 20 Hertz to 20 kilohertz. The input signal is 5 millivolts. The specification is plus or minus a half a dB for the phono stage, so it is way off of that, particularly at the high end of the band. It is at least, we'll call it maybe minus 3.8 dB or so. So the phono response is not stellar on this old Kenwood integrated amplifier. Right now we're looking at the difference in phase between the input, that would be the auxiliary output, and the left channel output, which is going into 8 ohms. of the KA-3500. This is done at 1 kilohertz, and it's showing that at 1 kilohertz we have really no difference in phase between the input and output signal. Now I've moved up the frequency to 10 kilohertz, and you can see that there is a bit of difference in phase, probably about maybe 15 to 20 degrees, I'm guessing. And at 100 hertz, we have a much smaller difference in phase, probably about 10 degrees. Right now we're looking at the difference in phase between the left and right channels, with them both going into 8 ohm loads, and it's probably about 4 watts or so that's going into the loads. There really is no difference between the phase of the left and right channels, at least at 1 kilohertz. This shows the rise time of the left channel, which is going into an 8 ohm load. The input is this purple trace, which has a 50 nanosecond rise time, and our yellow trace is the output, and it's showing about a 4.83 microsecond rise time. And there is no specification for the rise time for the KA-3500. As the test data showed, this particular KA-3500 did a pretty good job of meeting all of its specifications, except in the phono input response area. It definitely was way off on the frequency response. As far as its power, it was able to deliver its 40 watts into 8 ohms at not more than 0.2% THD, and overall its frequency response was better than its specifications. So as far as how it performed spec-wise, I thought it did a real good job. I like the feel of the controls. I like having the ability to turn the speakers off, and then you can select A, B, or A plus B. I do not like the connections for the speakers in back. Those are just a pain. I just don't like them. It doesn't have a pre-out main-in situation going on with it, but that is probably okay for most people. For my listening test, I connected it to my Klipsch La Scala loudspeakers, which are very efficient. And there was only a little bit of hiss and hum coming out when I terminated the input and selected that input with the volume control set for about 25 dB of gain or so. It was just the standard amount of hum or hiss that I would hear out of most receivers or amplifiers or integrated amps that were hooked up to the Klipsch or the Wilson Watt 3 Puppy 2 loudspeakers. So it didn't have anything that was out of the ordinary with the hums or hiss. As far as a turn on or turn off thump, depending, you might get a turn on thump. Under certain conditions, you could get that if you selected an input that wasn't terminated and you flipped it on. It might give you some sound, but if your input was connected to a CD player or something with some kind of a load, most likely you wouldn't hear any kind of a turn on thump, and there was no turn off thump with it. I like the way the controls work, and for the most part I thought it sounded really good hooked up to the Klipsch. I used the loudness control on. I like that extra bass, and it does a really good job with that, and it was just pleasant to listen to. I hooked up my Radio Shack APM 100 analog power meter to it, and the most I hit was 5 watts going into the La Scalas, which was enough to give me in the 92 dB SPL, which was plenty loud. At the low levels, you know, under 5 watts, this thing could be on all day and you probably wouldn't even know that it was on. It runs really cool at those low levels. So I just thought it did everything nice, and if you were looking for a nice vintage receiver at a decent price, I did see one of these on eBay. You'll see it right here for 200 bucks shipped. There were several in the $300 to $400 price range that had issues with them, so you know there's always some kind of a gamble. But if you have the ability to try one out first, or you know how to fix them, it's a nice basic receiver, and 40 watts is enough for a lot of people. So anyway, that's kind of my take on the Kenwood KA-3500. If you liked the video, of course, give me a thumbs up. If you have not subscribed to the channel, I would appreciate it if you would subscribe. And of course, I like hearing your comments, at least almost all of the time. So until next time, have a great day or night.